really related to something that we deal with a lot and increasingly in clinical research, and that's, as particularly in gene therapy and cell therapy, but other areas as well, how do we implement randomization at the same time being ethically sound with regard to informed consent, et cetera. Just quickly, SSI Strategy is my employer, and we are a management consulting firm that exclusively focuses on basically chief medical officer responsibilities within that chief medical office. And you can see the various functions in the CMO realm that we deal with, and some of our clients, which range from small emerging market companies to large pharmas. And this is a selection of this. You're more than welcome to look at the website if you're interested in learning more about us. And we're consultants, so you might hire us to flip a coin, but hopefully we can add more insight than that. And particularly with regard to this whole question of the ethics of randomization and informed consent. And the points that I would really make here is that uncertainty in medical knowledge has led to ineffective and potentially dangerous therapies. And because of this, the randomized clinical trial, which we probably all just automatically assume is the gold standard for evidence-based medicine and the foundation for approval of safe and effective medicines. And clearly this is what FDA and other regulatory bodies assume and work with. However, increasingly the ethics of randomized clinical trials have been challenged because there's an inherent tension between the investigator's obligation to his or her individual patient potentially versus executing the study, and particularly with regard to study design, enrollment, and execution. And at the end, if we have time, I'll mention some innovative proposals that have been put forward to potentially address these problems. I mentioned yesterday that COVID-19 is sort of a classic example of this with regard to both vaccine and therapeutics, the whole business of hydroxyurea, dexamethasone, remdesivir, et cetera. But since we don't know how that's going to turn out, it's obviously politically very charged. I'll take an example that I actually lived through. I was at the NIH shortly after HIV was described and participated in the first clinical trial of the first drug that had been developed for that, which was AZT. AZT had been developed a number of years earlier for cancer and it was ineffective. But then it turned out that in vitro it had activity against HIV. And because patients were essentially 100% mortality they were facing with horrible opportunistic infections like pneumocystis pneumonia, cytomegalovirus, Kaposi sarcoma, et cetera, there was a great clamor to get drugs available. And it was very controversial when this came out as to whether it was ethical to do a randomized trial where the only way the patient could get the drug would be to enroll in the trial, but they would have a 50-50 chance of getting a placebo versus the drug. And so there was a lot of political controversy at the time. Burroughs Wellcome had decided with the FDA that they were going to do a randomized control study with a placebo. And to make a long story short, they had envisioned a 300 patient study to address this. But interim analysis at 16 weeks basically led to canceling the study because there had been only one death in the subjects that were randomized to AZT versus, I believe, 19 in the control group. So at the time, it was the fastest approval by FDA. I think it was 20 months. and it went on the market. The problem was there were lots of questions because it was done in a short study, and subsequently we learned it had a lot of toxicity. We actually saw a lot of those patients in consultation because it caused bone marrow suppression and often transfusion dependence. So a number of other drugs came out there. And the problem is, as you can see in this table from the New England Journal of Medicine, if you look under the findings, they were all ineffective. And so it took some time for the next drug to be approved. And it raises this whole question of how much should you study a drug in an area where there's no treatment or inadequate treatment. And so if you think about this, the key stakeholders here are the potential trial subjects and their families, investigators, sponsors, ethical committees, IRBs, FDA, and importantly, future patients who may be treated with the drug, which is really the regulatory body's main concern. Now, when we do trials, we're always focused on safety and efficacy, which in regulatory speak translates into risk-benefit. So how to prioritize the interests of each of these stakeholders, and does this change at the stage of product development? And so I have a couple of survey questions that I'd like to just poll the group as to how they would see this. So the first question is, from an FDA or regulatory body perspective, what do you think they believe as to which stakeholders' risk-benefit is most important? Sam, can you put that up?
It looks like with this meeting from yesterday, the polling was not included because it's a separate meeting.
Oh, okay, so we don't have the survey?
No.
Okay, so essentially the vast majority of the respondents suggested that the main constituency is really the trial subject in the family versus future patients. However, the first question, I think it was like 2/3 of the respondents thought that the FDA was mainly concerned in the trial subjects. And then from the trial subjects perspective, it was like 90% people thought that the main focus would be on the trial subject, which is understandable, but it's not the way that regulatory bodies look at the question. So an important question that comes up here is this concept of clinical equipoise. And there's lots of literature about this in the medical ethics and clinical trial publications. And my understanding of this is, and what makes a clinical trial justified ethically, is that if you don't know which arm is going to be better for the subject, so if there's uncertainty, and then you can ethically say that the patient might be best off if he or she were randomized to the control or the experimental one, the placebo or the active comparator versus the study drug, then equipoise can be said to exist. Next question is, does the informed consent process adequately communicate this? We're all facing challenges in informed consent because FDA has given some guidelines to try to make it more understandable to subjects, and this has been a real challenge in making sure that the potential participant is truly informed. And then, as I mentioned in the AIDS story, is it ethical that the only way the participant can have access to the medicines is by participating in a placebo-controlled study? So the first point is that uncertainty in medical knowledge has led to ineffective and potentially dangerous therapies. Just some quick examples where the conclusion raised from non-randomized study ended up being contradicted by a randomized control study, in some cases really leading to patient harm until the data really came in from the randomized study. So early on, there was a great deal of interest in antioxidants and vitamin E for cardiovascular disease and also for cancer prevention. and a lot of uncontrolled observational studies suggested that you should take lots of vitamin E, et cetera, and some people did. However, the randomized trial, the first one that was done in 2000, showed no significant benefit in cardiovascular disease or stroke between vitamin and placebo groups. And in some cancer prevention studies, it actually showed that vitamin E increased the probability of cancer, for instance, in smokers. Next one is in human growth hormone. There had been earlier uncontrolled studies that suggested that intensive care unit patients on respirators would do better if they went on growth hormone. However, there were 2 randomized trials done in the late 90s that showed that these patients actually were at least twice as likely to die if they received the growth hormone versus placebo. And then probably the biggest one from a public, or from at least a health economics perspective, was that there was a lot of interest in autologous bone marrow transplant patients for cancer chemotherapy subjects in breast cancer. And it became so popular and so much emphasized that people sued insurance companies when they would not cover for this. It was in the press. Obviously, the breast cancer lobby is very influential, but it turned out it offered no benefit, so it caused a lot of morbidity with no improved outcome, which was only discovered in randomized trials. So that's why randomized trials are considered the gold standard. Here's an important quote from 96, and this is sort of why do you randomize? The quote says, "A doctor who contributes to a randomized treatment trial should not be thought of as a research worker, but simply as a clinician with an ethical duty to his patients not to go on giving them treatments without doing everything possible to assess their true worth." And why is randomization so important? Well, there are a lot of things that can lead to misleading conclusions in clinical trials, but at the top are chance and bias. So to limit chance, you simply need to have adequate numbers in each cohort. It's like if you flip a coin 10 times, you might get 10 heads, but if you flip it 100 times, that's less likely to happen. And then in terms of bias, randomization is the best way. And I'll show you an example in women's health where this became very important and led to important changes in how women prevent or were interested in improving cardiovascular health. So in theory, a perfectly randomized trial will only show a difference between the study drug and the placebo, and everything else, the 2 groups will be the same in terms of what they the features that they showed going in and how they're treated. The first randomized trial, and this is kind of funny, was actually done on a ship or ships in Britain in the 1740s. Scurvy had basically wiped out a good part of the British fleet in the war against Spain. And so there was a lot of interest in dealing with this. It was believed that the disease scurvy represented putrefaction of parts of the body and could be treated by acid. But James Lind, who was a surgeon in the Royal Navy, was interested in this. There'd been anecdotal evidence that limes or lemons were beneficial. So he did the first published clinical randomized trial of 12 patients. He had 6 treatment groups, 2 subjects in each group, and I'll just tell you for fun, these 6 groups. The first one just got a normal diet of what sailors got. The second group got a normal diet plus a quarter quart of cider per day. The third got the normal diet plus sulfuric acid. The fourth got a normal diet and a pint of seawater. The fifth got a normal diet plus 2 oranges and 1 lemon. And the sixth received a normal diet plus spicy paste and a drink of barley water. So nobody really improved much except a little bit in one of the 2 sailors that got the cider. But the 2 sailors who got the oranges and the lemon really improved and could go back to duty. And so this was considered, was published in 1747, and this was considered the first randomized trial. in the modern era, Austin Bradford Hill was a biostatistician in the UK and did a study for streptomycin and tuberculosis, and that's viewed as the first sort of modern era randomized trial. I won't show this. This is just what we all know about how randomized trials go. Here are a couple more examples of how you get different conclusions if you do randomized and unrandomized trial and can lead to patient harm. So there were two antiarrhythmic drugs in 86 and 87 that were approved based upon glowing results in non-randomized trial. That was before the FDA kind of became very aware of this. In 1989, it showed that these drugs increase mortality. And then, as I mentioned, hormone replacement therapy in the late 90s was very popular, not only to relieve hot flashes and other symptoms of menopause, but actually were thought to have protective effects against coronary artery disease and stroke. And when the NIH funded a randomized trial called the Women's Health Initiative, it showed that estrogen plus progesterone actually increased myocardial infarction, and estrogen alone provided no benefit. Well, why was this? And you can see in the left-hand part of the slide headlines from the Wall Street Journal and New York Times about how popular this was, and many women were taking this. The panel on the right shows the problem. So if you take all of the non-randomized studies that had led to all this enthusiasm, in this graph, numbers or data points that fall to the left show benefit of the hormone replacement therapy. The line shows no benefit, and the right side would show harm. And what you can see is that those early studies showed benefit, but they were not controlled for socioeconomic and demographic status, whereas when they were randomized and this was controlled, it was showed they were no benefit. So what caused that was that women who were more highly educated, more wealthy, would tend to be more likely to take hormone replacement therapy. They had better health in general and better medical care, and that was what led to the benefit, not the drug. So this indicates why this is important. I mentioned informed consent, and how do we get patients to understand this? And this is an old study from the Journal of Clinical Oncology, but it pertains to phase 1 studies in cancer patients. And any phase 1 study, as we know, is mostly for safety and potentially for pharmacokinetics. But when they wanted to find out why do cancer patients sign up for this, they did a survey. And this is obviously representative of how the study is explained to them in the informed consent. And the vast majority of these subjects actually thought that they would benefit from enrolling in the trial, which is not correct. And so their reason for participating was not really accurate, even though it went through full informed consent. And only a small number were motivated to help advance science and medicine and potentially benefit themselves and future patients. So we have a lot to do to really improve informed consent. And because of this, the ethics of randomized trials have been challenged because of this conflict between the investigator's obligation to their individual subject or their patient versus carrying out the clinical trial. This is a study that was published in 2018 of all randomized clinical trial publications in the year 2015 in the New England Journal of Medicine and in JAMA. And they found that about 56% of these studies were not scientifically justified and therefore would not be considered ethical to enroll patients into. There's a even more alarming paper that appeared in 2009 that suggests that 85% of biomedical research was really a waste of time and money. And these authors highlighted those questions I mentioned before. Is there really clinical equipoise so that it's ethical, that you don't know whether a patient is going to be better off, whether they're enrolled in a control arm versus the study drug arm? does the informed consent really convey to the subjects the reality of the situation? And is it ethical to only allow subjects to get the drug if they participate in a trial and therefore can get placebo or something else? Also, there's conflicts of interest that sometimes aren't disclosed. So I just put a bunch of headlines up here as to where this challenge has come. In vitamin D study, vitamin D is obviously a very benign, if taken normally, a vitamin. Is it ethical when you have subjects who are vitamin D deficient or maybe normal levels to do a randomized trial? A big question, which I'll just allude to in a moment, is a big challenge for decades has been if you have coronary artery disease, but you're relatively stable, you're not having unstable angina or other problems, are you best off being managed by medical therapy or by intervention with percutaneous angioplasty, stents, that kind of thing? Also CPAP, is it appropriate to do a randomized trial in that? It's even more challenging in developing countries. In this article I cited here, selenium supplementation was evaluated in pregnant women with HIV in Nigeria. And it was said, is this an ethical study to do as opposed to just giving them the selenium? In the other article, you see there this big question about what's the best way to treat aortic stenosis, the traditional aortic valve surgical replacement or transcatheter aortic valve implementation, and can you do a randomized study in that? And in general, diet-related research is thought to be ethically problematic. I mentioned that coronary artery intervention in stable patients, is that an appropriate study to do? So here, it's a study about percutaneous coronary intervention in patients based upon fractional flow reserve. And they were saying that is the scale here equal for intervention or just medical therapy? So you can say that on the intervention side, you might anticipate reduced myocardial infarction, less angina, less use of anti-anginal drugs. On the right side, the benefit might be would be fewer invasive procedures. And so the question is it ethical to do such a study? This is a British study that came out in 1998 that really looked at some of these issues. And what they found is the doctors did not take informed consent from competent patients as seriously as they should, as demonstrated by that oncology report I shared earlier. And it was just, and this is understandable, if they're under pressure to enroll patients, as we all are, do they really adequately consider what language should be in the informed consent form and when they talk to the patients? This next point is of concern. Most doctors expressed willingness to enter their patients into trials even when the treatments offered were widely available, but were not an equal bet prospectively. In other words, there wasn't equipoise. And this reduces, if the public becomes aware of this, it reduces confidence in the healthcare system. What's interesting is the third point is what they found is when the patient understands more about the trial, they're less likely to enroll, which of course is the opposite of what we and our management wants, because they're just interested in enrollment rates. And then the fourth point was also referred to in the oncology paper, is a large number of participants in phase 3, but even in phase 1, go into that because they expect to benefit personally, not understanding that depending upon the luck of the draw, so to speak, the randomization, it may not benefit them. So they're focused on self-interest rather than sort of advancing science or future patients, which gets back to the survey question we had. Another point, which is obvious to all the statisticians, is that lots of so-called negative trials that are randomized really might not be really negative, but might be underpowered, and it's not really ethical to enroll a patient and present the risk to them if ultimately the study itself is not well designed to get an accurate answer. So finally, I want to just mention some proposals that have been thrown out there about ways of addressing this, and two in particular have been described as just-in-time consent or trials within cohorts. In panel A, you see our traditional study that a patient signs up, and for informed consent, they understand all the risks and so on. Then they're randomized to get either the experimental intervention or control. Whereas in this proposal, there's two stages of consent. One is a broad consent to participate in a randomized trials, the various procedures that would happen, and then they're randomized. And then a second consent is taken for those patients that are randomized to the experimental intervention. They get all the details of what might happen with the drug, whereas the second cohort that's randomized to control just gets the sort of the same kind of information they got the first time of just being in a randomized trial, because these investigators believe that a lot of people actually experience a lot of stress and anxiety from having to face the informed consent. And so this is one approach to dealing with that. What they've said is that these kinds of trials are thought to be legitimate in terms of the analysis if they're evaluated under intent to treat. So it gets rid of that selection bias. What it doesn't do is deal for those patients that drop out in the second phase because they're getting the drug and they decide once they know all the details of the treatment, they're going to, they decline. So that has to be dealt with. These are just the findings from that earlier review I mentioned of the 2015 publications in New England Journal and JAMA. And essentially what they conclude is that a majority of these trials do not have a scientific hypothesis, that equipoise has not really been dealt with, and that because it's not scientifically sound, it's not ethically to enroll patients. So therefore, people have said, well, maybe there are other applications for certain situations that might address some of these short of a randomized trial. So you can have a prospective follow-up study, a retrospective follow-up study, case control studies using historical controls, and probably the lowest quality information is from anecdotal studies like case reports and series. This, however, provides a reality check, because there are certain things that you would never even think of doing a randomized or other trial. Diabetics need insulin. If somebody's got severe hemorrhagic shock, you're going to give them a blood transfusion without worrying about a trial. And so there's a long list of things here that really it doesn't make sense to require a randomized clinical trial. And this is a subject a lot today with regard to both vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19, just like back in the day, this was dealt with in terms of HIV and the whole ACT story. So that kind of concludes our jet tour of this, and I'd be interested in any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey. And if anybody has a question, do please type it in the Q&A box. You have an option of typing it. We can all discuss your questions openly. So if you do, or if you are interested in this slide deck, just email myself, Sherry, or you can reach Dr. Jeffrey at his SSI address, which we'll share later on. So we do have one question from Gerald Shapiro. How can you mask treatment with a medical device?
That's an extremely good question. I worked for a company one time that the product was blood-based and it was red. And so what we did was we basically covered the IV bags, all the tubing and stuff, so they couldn't tell what's being done. There have been trials which are also ethically questionable that use sham procedures. And so even in CNS injections for gene therapy or other kinds of things, people have proposed and I think done sham procedures in which they do some sort of a procedure that the subject wouldn't know which they had. So I think with devices, it's more difficult. And you also have the risk, if it's at all a risk, there's some level of risk in that it's hard to justify exposing control patients to that risk.
Wonderful. We have a question from Oren Seabag. He's VP Business Development from Clinical Maestro. He asked for your thoughts on the new COVID-19 challenge study in the UK from an ethical perspective.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that specific trial, but I do know, having followed it pretty closely, that inclusion criteria are extremely important because, and this came up with AZT and was one of the criticisms that was raised against that trial, is that it didn't control for whether somebody was in the intensive care unit or newly diagnosed, was enrollment based upon a positive test or whatever. And so I think we've seen that, for instance, dexamethasone, which has been shown to have benefit in intensive care unit patients, it's not clear what it does in other subjects, although I understand the President of the United States claimed that it helped him when he was, minimally symptomatic. So I do think that all of these principles for, sound science pertain to all the COVID trials. And in this, there's not so much an issue of, I haven't seen the specific design as I mentioned, but typically what you would look at is standard of care. So you don't want to deny the control population how they would be treated anyways, and then superimposed another intervention on top of that. And I think in general, that's considered ethically acceptable, but it's really important to delineate what the inclusion criteria are so that when the drug gets approved, if it gets approved, that the indication is clear with regard to the population, knowing that doctors may well use it, as did the physicians caring for President Trump, beyond what the label might indicate.
Wonderful. And we have one last question for you from Dr. Allison Gage, Chief Medical Officer of Cohen. She asked, right here, when the treatment group has more information due to greater detail in a second ICF process, how is expectation bias, whether efficacy or safety, handled?
Again, this, I believe, and I don't have any personal experience with this, so I'm not sure. There are some good publications about this, including one in 2018 in JAMA, but my understanding is that other than the informed consent process, it's handled in terms of blinding, et cetera, the same way that a conventionally consented trial would be. And its claim to fame, really, and its main value is subjects have shown that, and I mentioned that the informed consent process is problematic because it gives a lot of anxiety to subjects. I have been on a study that had a voluminous informed consent study in a gene therapy trial, and the patients can get a lot of anxiety from that. And so the main reason for this is to relieve unnecessary agita, so to speak, for the half a group that's in control. And at least it's claimed that it would eliminate that kind of selection bias in terms of who participates or not. And it would be analyzed by intent to treat. But one of the big flaws that I see is that it doesn't account for subjects who fall out and withdraw consent or don't issue consent for the second stage. So I think it'll be interesting. You've heard the term pragmatic clinical trial, and there's a lot of overlap in that. So I think we'll learn a lot more in the coming years about the pros and cons of these designs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey. As mentioned, his slide deck will be available and his contact information from SSI Strategy, him, his colleague Nova Silver, and others. For those that are interested in connecting after the event, we'll share that. And I guess Dr. Jeffrey will go along with the program.
Great.